A rather odd childhood experience. Hey there. I thought I'd share one of my own strange and creepy childhood experiences after reading others' stories. It happened when I was a teenager living in Austin, Texas. I had a friend, let's call him John, who came over one day to hang out and play Xbox while my mom was out. About 30 minutes into our gaming session, we heard a loud cracking noise from upstairs. We figured it was one of my cats. I had two, so we brushed it off and kept playing. A few hours later, the power suddenly went out. John said he had to head home because his mom wanted him back, so he left after a few minutes. After he left, I decided to unwind by watching some TV. Once I started feeling drowsy, I headed to bed. That's when the real horror began. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. to the sound of a muffled scream. That noise alone froze me in place, my mind racing. I strained to hear more, and sure enough, I heard the unmistakable sound of the back door creaking open. My stomach dropped as I realized I had forgotten to lock it. I'm a pretty big guy, but in that moment, fear paralyzed me. I grabbed the hammer I had left on my nightstand. I had been using it earlier to hang some art, and tried to steady my breathing. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the house, getting closer and closer. My instincts kicked in, and I bolted for the closet, shutting the door quietly behind me as I called 911. I whispered to the dispatcher that there was someone in my house and that I was hiding in the closet. She told me to stay put and stay quiet, and that officers were on their way. Every second felt like an eternity. Then, I heard the intruder coming upstairs. His footsteps stopped right outside my bedroom door. I realized I'd made a critical mistake. I'd left the Xbox on, its faint glow spilling into the room. The man stepped inside. For a moment, everything went silent, and then I heard him freeze. After what felt like forever, he bolted. I could hear him sprinting down the stairs as sirens wailed in the distance. I let out a shaky breath, whispering, "Thank fucking God." Peeking out my window, I saw a police car pull up and an officer running toward my backyard. They'd seen him. I made my way downstairs and onto the porch, trying to process what had just happened. That's when I got a good look at the guy they arrested. He was disturbingly pale, almost translucent and unnervingly thin, like he hadn't eaten in weeks. But the most haunting thing, the man had no lips, just exposed teeth, making his face look like something out of a nightmare. As they cuffed him and put him in the back of the car, the scene got even stranger. The man suddenly vomited blood all over the window. I stood there speechless as the cops quickly drove off with him. Later, I found out the man had died that night from a meth overdose. He'd been high out of his mind, which explained his behavior, but it didn't make the whole ordeal any less horrifying. A true story shared by a Native inmate. A few years ago, I heard a chilling tale from a Native American inmate. Let's call him Storm. While I was working in a maximum security prison overseeing food production. This story resurfaced in my memory recently, prompting me to wonder if anyone else has encountered this legend or if it was simply a creation of Storm's imagination. Storm, who I believe was Navajo, often shared stories and legends during our conversations. One morning, as we discussed urban legends, he told me about a creature from his reservation, a being he called Hoofy. At first it sounded like any other folklore monster, but what made it unforgettable was Storm's claim of a personal encounter with this sinister entity. According to Storm, Hoofy is a devilish creature that takes the form of a charming, handsome man. Dressed impeccably in a tall white cowboy hat and polished boots, Hoofy frequents casinos, not to gamble but to lure unsuspecting young women. He woos them with his charisma, enticing them to leave with him. However, once they reach his home, his true form is revealed. A towering beast with shaggy goat legs, long black hair, and a grotesque face combining features of a demonic horse and a wolf, complete with piercing red eyes. The women he captures are devoured, their clothing left scattered as eerie trophies. At first, I laughed at the absurdity of it, but Storm's demeanor turned deadly serious. He claimed that he and his cousin barely escaped Hoofy during an encounter on their reservation. Storm and his cousin lived near South Mountain in Arizona, not far from Estrella Mountain. One day, while trying to pass the time, the two decided to explore the desert. The sun was nearing the horizon, casting long shadows as they wandered for about 15 minutes before stumbling upon an old, dilapidated church. Its wooden structure was crumbling, and the inside was filled with broken pews and creaky floorboards. They joked about how eerie it was, but their laughter faded as they left the church and found something unsettling. A scattered collection of women's shoes. Muddied red high heels, torn brown pumps, and other worn-out footwear littered the ground. Storm picked up a shoe to examine it when he noticed his cousin's face, pale, wide-eyed, and frozen in terror. His cousin whispered, "Don't look up. Keep your head down." Storm obeyed, his heart pounding. He then heard heavy footsteps behind him, accompanied by labored breathing. The air around him turned cold as his cousin gripped his shoulder and urged him, "Whatever you do, don't look back." With that, his cousin bolted, and Storm followed, adrenaline drowning out his fear. As they sprinted past the old church, his cousin began chanting prayers in their native tongue, desperate for protection. Behind them, Storm heard the galloping of hooves and felt hot, foul-smelling breath on his neck, like the stench of decayed flesh. The pair ran faster than they ever thought possible, cutting their return time in half. They burst into their home just as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the desert in an orange glow. Panting and trembling, Storm couldn't resist the urge to confirm what had pursued them. He crept to a window, lifted the blind, and looked out. In the fading light, he saw the creature walking away. It stood over 8 feet tall, with long black hair cascading down its back. Its legs, grotesque and goat-like, ended in black hooves that kicked up dust as it moved. Though its back was to him, the mere sight of the monstrous figure left an indelible mark on Storm. Storm's story lingered with me long after he told it. His vivid description and the fear in his eyes as he recounted the tale made it hard to dismiss. Why you shouldn't get out of your car at night. This story isn't mine, but comes from a close friend of mine. Let's call her Jess. Even though it didn't happen to me, it still gives me chills every time I think about it. Jess was driving home late one night from her parents' house, taking a quiet rural route in southern Germany. Everything was uneventful until she came across a large log lying across the road, completely blocking her path. It was frustrating because this was the only road that could get her home without adding an extra hour to her journey. Reluctantly, she got out of her car to move the log. The area seemed calm and empty, no signs of wildlife or anything out of the ordinary. Germany's rural areas are generally pretty tame when it comes to wildlife, so she didn't feel particularly concerned. After what felt like a while, she managed to clear the road and got back into her car. That's when she noticed another car had pulled up behind her. At first, she didn't think much of it, assuming the driver was just another person on the same route waiting for her to move the obstruction. As she continued driving, however, the car stayed behind her. Initially, she chalked it up to coincidence. It was a single road with nowhere else to turn off. But as they entered the next town and the car continued to follow her, Jess started to feel uneasy. Trying to stay calm, she called the police and explained the situation, giving them her location and letting them know she was heading home. She asked them to meet her there in case the stranger behind her was up to something. Since she was almost home, Jess decided to park a few houses away from her actual address just to be cautious. She stayed in her car, keeping the doors locked and watching the other car, which pulled up and parked right behind her. Her anxiety skyrocketed as the driver got out and approached her vehicle. The man waved at her, gesturing toward the back of her car. Jess cracked her window just slightly to ask what he wanted. The man told her he had been following her to warn her. He explained that while she had been moving the log, he saw someone sneak into the trunk of her car. Jess didn't believe him at first. It sounded too bizarre. But then he showed her his phone, proving that he had already called the police before approaching her. Reluctantly, Jess got out of the car, staying close to the man. Within minutes, the police arrived. They opened her trunk and found someone hiding inside. A stranger who clearly had ill intentions. He was arrested on the spot. It turned out that the man who had been following her really was trying to help. Jess was understandably shaken. She never found out exactly who the person in her trunk was or what they planned to do, but it was clear they meant harm, possibly burglary or worse. Since then, I've learned from Jess's experience and never leave my car unlocked, even for a moment. I also check my trunk and back seat before getting in, every single time. For context, Jess was driving a Skoda Octavia at the time, which has a trunk that's directly connected to the rest of the car. That means the person hiding there could have crawled into the back seat at any point, making the whole ordeal even more terrifying. Weird conversation with a delivery man. I live in a small town, and some things here happen differently than in bigger places. This story happened about 7 years ago, but it still gives me chills. I had ordered 2 desks for my sons, and their dad, my ex, had promised to come over to help assemble them. When the delivery day came, I let him know. He had taken the boys on a short walk and said they'd be back soon. My neighbor, who lives behind me, breeds and trains guard dogs. These dogs often patrol my yard and come to me for treats and attention, so I felt relatively secure at home. When the delivery man arrived, I asked if he could bring the desk kits inside. From the moment he stepped in, I got a strange vibe. Over the years, I've learned to trust my instincts, and something about him didn't feel right. He started making small talk, which seemed harmless at first, but then he asked, "So, do you live alone?" That question immediately set off alarm bells. Keeping my guard up, I replied casually, "Oh, I wish. My teenage sons are here, and they always have friends over. Between them, neighbors and family members, this house feels like a revolving door most of the time. Right now, it's rare to have a quiet moment. They'll be back any minute with their dad." The delivery man's expression changed, in a way that made me even more uneasy. Then he asked if I was seeing anyone. At this point, my instincts were screaming danger. I forced myself to stay calm and polite while figuring out how to get him out of my house without escalating the situation. Before I could respond, I heard the front door open. My sons and their dad came in, the boys excitedly showing off their new store-bought treats before running over to see the desk kits. The timing couldn't have been better. To top it off, my neighbor's guard dogs trotted over, and as the delivery man walked out, they started low growling at him. My ex, who has sharp instincts and is a skilled fighter, picked up on the tension immediately. He stayed alert until the delivery man finally left. As soon as the door closed, I grabbed my phone to report the incident. Before I could say anything, my ex turned to me and asked, "Are you going to report him?" Here's where small-town life played its part. I reported the incident to a local woman who's known for being a bit of a gossip and a go-to source for information. Conveniently, she was also a manager at the furniture store where the delivery man worked. It turns out I wasn't the only woman who had called to complain about him. After my report, he was fired. A few days later, I got calls from some town busybodies wanting details, and I decided to share what had happened. It felt important to spread the word so others could stay vigilant. Looking back, it was a terrifying experience. I'm grateful for my instincts, the timing of my family's return, and even the dogs. In small towns, news travels fast, and in this case, that might have prevented something worse from happening. Creepy experiences. First off, a bit about myself. I'm an avid catfisher. I love the peace and quiet of fishing at night and often stay out extremely late, on nights I don't have work. That love for the solitude of nighttime fishing led me to an experience I can't quite explain, but it still gives me chills. I can't remember exactly which day it was, but I was alone. My girlfriend at the time wasn't interested in coming, and I couldn't convince any friends to join me. So I decided to head out by myself, grabbing my gear and my gun, just in case. For a few hours, everything was normal. I caught a couple of fish, but during the night, I started hearing faint voices. I couldn't see anyone around, so I figured they might be walking down the road nearby and paid it no mind. A while later, I heard a whistle. It wasn't just some background noise, it was sharp and deliberate, the kind someone makes to get your attention. I looked around but saw nothing, so I went back to fishing. Then it happened again, this time to my right. I started to think maybe it was some kids playing around, but there was no one in sight. As I turned back to my fishing, I noticed a cat sitting nearby. It seemed odd, but I brushed it off and continued. Moments later, another whistle, this one directly behind me. I turned to look, and the cat was gone. At this point, I decided to reel in my lines. I wasn't about to risk losing a $200 pole, and cautiously checked around the building near me, gun in hand. But there was nothing. No movement, no sounds, and no crunch of gravel, which made no sense because it was impossible to walk there silently. As I turned to head back, I heard a loud, piercing whistle right behind me. It was so sudden and shrill that I instinctively spun around, drawing my gun. My heart was racing, and I grabbed my gear and bolted to my car. About a week later, I went back to the same spot, this time with a friend. I'd almost forgotten about the weird whistling. The night started off normal, and we were having a decent time. But as the hours passed, I started noticing shadows in the trees across the lake. They seemed to move and jump near the lights, but I figured it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. What I didn't know was that my friend saw the exact same thing. He didn't tell me until later, probably not wanting to freak me out. Around 3 a.m., I began hearing faint voices again, but I couldn't see anyone. The lake is like a pit, surrounded by roads, so it should have been impossible for someone to walk by unnoticed. Then, around 3:15 a.m., I heard birds chirping. It struck me as odd. Why would birds be active in the dead of night? I turned to my friend and asked, "Do you hear the birds chirping? Isn't that weird?" He looked uneasy and said, "Those aren't birds chirping. Someone's mimicking them." I stared at him, confused, and he reminded me of a story my coworker had told me. A story about strange incidents at the lake and why they no longer allowed swimming there. As soon as he mentioned the deaths associated with the lake, everything changed. The crickets stopped chirping. The wind died completely. Even the fish stopped biting. One of my poles, which had been tugged by a fish, suddenly went slack. The silence was suffocating, and I felt a crushing heaviness in my chest, like it was hard to breathe. My friend whispered, "Do you feel that?" I nodded. The air felt wrong, thick with dread. "Bro, let's pack up and go," he said. We quickly gathered our gear. As we were rushing back to the car, the chirping noises started again, this time closer. My friend spun around, knife in hand, and I instinctively drew my gun. "What are you doing?" I hissed. "There's something behind us. It's running. Charging us." We didn't stick around to find out what it was. We got into the car and sped off. Typing this out still makes my skin crawl. I don't believe in the supernatural, ghosts, werewolves, or anything like that. But something about that night wasn't right. I can't explain it, and the memory haunts me. To make things worse, since that night, I've started noticing footprints in the grass around my home, and strange noises in the dead of night. I don't know what's going on, but it feels like whatever I experienced at the lake hasn't quite left me alone. He threatened to kill me. This happened when I was 19. I'm in my late 30s now, but the memory of it still lingers. Back then, I worked as a waitress at a quaint, old-fashioned diner in my city. It was a fun job, and the diner was charming, with its bar area, jukebox, and 24/7 service. We served breakfast and lunch and had a steady flow of regulars, many of whom were older men who'd shamelessly flirt and tell crude jokes. Being young and putting a lot of effort into my appearance, I often found myself the subject of their attention. One day, a tall man walked in a couple of hours before my shift ended. He took a seat at the bar, and I did what I always did, greeted him, gave him a cup of water, and left him a menu. I told him to call me over when he was ready to order. He didn't respond. Instead, he just stared at me with an unsettling smile. Feeling uneasy, I asked if he'd heard me. Still nothing, just that same creepy smile and unwavering stare. Brushing it off, I walked away, but I could feel his eyes following me everywhere. When I approached him again to ask if he wanted to order anything, he introduced himself as Anthony. I asked again if he was planning to order, and he stood up, said, "I'm going to marry you," and walked out. It was a strange moment, but the rest of my shift picked up, and I didn't think much more about it until my next shift. Anthony showed up again, taking the same seat at the bar. This time, I skipped the menu and just brought him water, figuring he wasn't planning to order anything. Once again, he just stared and smiled. His behavior was creeping me out, so I told my manager, who asked him to leave if he wasn't ordering. Anthony stood up, walked to the door, and before leaving, turned to me and said, "You're going to be my wife." By now, I was thoroughly unnerved, but things escalated on my next shift. I was sweeping the dining area when I noticed Anthony standing outside, staring at me through the glass doors. When our eyes met, he smiled and ran off. My stomach dropped. I had 2 days off after that and tried to put it out of my mind, but when I returned, things took a darker turn. It was early, and the usual old regulars were there, joking about how I was the type of high-maintenance girl mentioned in Kanye's Gold Digger. While I filled their coffee cups, Anthony walked in and took his usual seat at the bar. I ignored him, but their jokes must have triggered something in him. Out of nowhere, Anthony slammed his hand on the counter and screamed that I was a money-hungry BTCH. The diner went dead silent. My heart was racing, and I yelled at him to leave. Instead, he stormed to the door, turned back, and screamed, "Bitch, I'm gonna kill you," before running out. I was terrified, shaking, unable to think straight. My manager sent me to the storage room to calm down. There, I called the non-emergency police number and spoke to a kind lady officer. She took my statement and Anthony's description and sent a patrol car to look for him, but he was long gone. From that day forward, my family rallied around me. Every day, a different relative came to the diner, sitting through my shift to keep me company. It was such a sweet gesture and made me feel safer. About 2 weeks later, the same officer called me with an update. Anthony had been arrested on drug charges. He confessed to stalking and threatening me, and because he had given me his real first name, the police were able to confirm it was him. She assured me I no longer needed to worry. He was going to prison for a while. Years passed, and I continued working at the diner part-time while attending college. One day, I was sweeping the dining area when Anthony walked in. For a moment, it felt like time stopped. My chest tightened, and fear gripped me as I froze, unable to move or speak. To my surprise, Anthony immediately apologized. He said he was sorry for how he'd acted back then, explaining that he'd been high on drugs and in a bad place. He asked for my forgiveness. His sincerity caught me off guard. I told him I forgave him, and he left. I never saw him again. Unfortunately, all the diners closed down eventually, the last one during the pandemic. But even after all these years, I'll never forget how terrifying it was to feel so vulnerable, and how grateful I was for the support of my family and the kind officer who took my case seriously.